Okay, so our webinar this evening is on co-production. I'm not going to say too much more than that really, but we heard from you guys over the last couple of weeks that you wanted something around co-production. Yeah. No, we wanted something about co-production as we move away from the command and control phase, and there's now maybe a little bit more space or more time to involve co-production and co-design. Maybe there was that space and time before, but that's probably something for the debate at the end. You've got 4 of us with you this evening, plus Fiona and Kelly. We're really, really pleased to have Glenn Robert with us. I will let him introduce himself a little bit later. Many of you know me, I'm Katie Campion, I'm the co-production innovation lead at Bridges, and we've got Scott and Claire who are going to do a segment for us as well. They're both lived experience associates, so kind of patients or ex-patients. Scott's also our comms and engagement manager, and they're going to do a bit of a Q&A back and forth after Glenn's section. We had quite a few technical issues a few seconds before coming on air, so we hopefully have sorted those out. But Fiona, I'm going to pass over to you to share your screen, and I'm going to hand over to you, Glenn, to do what you can with that, which I'm sure will be brilliant.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, very happy to be here. So Fiona is going to be my right hand woman and do the slides. So I'm from King's College London. I'm a sociologist there. I don't have any expertise in stroke or indeed a clinical or nursing background. I'm working around change and quality improvement in health and social care. I'm going to be talking about co-production and the power of patients in design. And if you want to catch up with me afterwards, if we don't get time to discuss things, just drop me an email or you can find me on Twitter. Okay, Fiona, thank you. So what I'm going to do, I've just got 20 minutes, so I've broken it into 4 5-minute sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about co-production and co-design and how I at least define them and the distinction between them. Then I'm going to talk about a specific co-design approach that I've been working with for about the last 16 years in healthcare called experience-based co-design. I'm going to give you a quick example of an experience-based co-design project from a learning disabilities service called My Care, My Voice. And then we'll end with a project that Fiona led, funded by the National Institute for Health Research, called CREATE, Collaborative Rehabilitation Environments in Acute Stroke. Okay, Fiona, thank you. Okay, so co-production kind of co-design. Next slide, please, Fiona. Right, so I think it's important whenever you talk about co-production to be clear about your definitions, because often you might start having a conversation about co-production and about half an hour in you find out that actually you're talking about rather different things. So this is how I define co-production and how I think about it, and you may have a different definition in mind, or you may think about it in slightly different ways, and we can come back to that in discussion, but just to be clear where I'm sort of starting from. So my interest in co-production really stems back to someone called Eleanor Erstrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Economics. She was a political economist, and she studied police services in and around Chicago back in the early 70s. And she found that some police services in and around Chicago were more effective than others. And the reason for that was because the extent to which citizens in different boroughs around Chicago co-produced those police services. So how responsive were they working with the police in their areas? Some were more, some were less, and that impacted essentially on the effectiveness on police services. So she came up with this definition. Co-production implies that citizens can play an active role in producing public goods and services of consequence to them. And then later, the New Economics Foundation, and this is an important distinction, I think, co-production means delivering the delivery of public services in an equal and reciprocal relationship between professionals, people using services, their families and their neighbours. And then Catherine Needham, same year, co-production, very simply, people who use services contribute to the production of services. So that's co-production. Distinction with co-design, and they do come from 2 different literatures and 2 different disciplines. So co-design, a well-established approach to creative practice. Next bullet, please, thank you. It enables a wide range of people to make a creative contribution in the formulation and solution of a problem. So how do designers, architects, think about designing a new building or a new piece of software. They use very sort of creative techniques. Builds and deepens equal collaboration between citizens affected by or attempting to resolve a particular challenge. So users, service users, are experts of their own experience. They have the specialist form of knowledge, which is their lived experience, and that becomes central to the design process. Co-design enables people to engage with each other, as well as providing ways to communicate, be creative, share insights, and test out new ideas. So co-design is about creating new spaces for different types of conversations to take place between service users, patients, and those providing the service, healthcare professionals. And it uses a wide range of tools and techniques to support that co-design process. And examples would include user personas, storyboards, user journeys, prototyping, scenario generation techniques. Some of these techniques and tools and methods have sort of crept into quality improvement in healthcare, but lots of them are relatively new for quality improvement work, and we could be using them a lot more. Thanks, Fiona. And the co-design process using those creative techniques looks a bit like this. So at the beginning, very messy, very complex, very emergent as you try to get an understanding of what the service or product is that you're trying to co-design. And through typically sort of quite ethnographic work, qualitative work, understanding lived experience, you begin to hone down what the design criteria might be for the service or product. You use ideation techniques to come up with new ideas for how to improve the service or to develop the product. And then you use prototyping to test the kind of initial concepts that you have. And then that leads through the prototyping, the iterative testing to the new product or service. And the distinction, at least in my mind, this is the one that I carry around with me, the distinction between co-design and co-production. So co-designing a service involves sharing decision-making power with people. This means that most people's voices must be heard, valued, debated, and then most importantly, acted upon through that co-design process that I've just briefly introduced. The distinction is co-production goes one step further than co-design by enabling people to play roles in delivering the services that they have designed. So it's that role in actually also delivering the service that makes the distinction between co-production and co-design. Okay, next slide, Fiona. So I find this a useful kind of matrix to sort of explain this distinction between co-production and co-design. So along the top, you've got responsibility for design of a service, of a healthcare service. Down the side, responsibility for the delivery of a service. Where professionals and service users or the community are both co-planners and co-deliverers of that service, then that is co-production. Can you just do one click, Fiona? Where the professionals and service users are co-planners, but the delivery is still by the professionals, by the healthcare professionals, then that's co-design. And there's a sort of spectrum between those two boxes. Some co-design projects might lead to co-production, because what may come out of the co-design process may be that service users should be much more involved in the delivery of that service, and then you're co-producing the service. But not all co-design projects inevitably lead to co-production. Next slide, Fiona. So what I'm going to talk about, introduce briefly now, this is a particular approach to co-design that I was involved with developing about 16 years ago. We piloted it in a head and neck cancer service in Luton and Dunstable. Can you do a couple of clicks, Fiona? And that was the original project team 16 years ago, where really we were just taking some of the design thinking and co-design. Next slide, Fiona. And the basis for the project really was that we thought there might be some value in integrating some of the human-centered tools and the values of co-design, which are very much around relational processes and new spaces for healthcare professionals, patients to have different types of conversations. We could take those tools and those processes, and that would add value to quality improvement in healthcare organizations. And so we developed this co-design approach called experience-based co-design, and we applied it to quality improvement work in healthcare services. If you're interested, then there's a free-to-use toolkit that sits on the Point of Care Foundation website. There's lots of, it's not written by me, it's written by practitioners who've used the approach. There's lots of films and case studies and tools and tips there. Thanks, Fiona. So this is the EBCD approach. I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but it's a 6-stage approach, starting with setting up, So getting the sort of nuts and bolts of the change process set up, making sure you've got your stakeholders involved, the people who are able to influence the redesign, co-design of the service, engaging staff and gathering their experiences. We use lots of non-participant observation to really get a sense of what it's like to work in this service and to deliver healthcare. And we do semi-structured interviews with the staff to understand their perspective, what it's like for them. Then engaging patients and gathering their experiences. We use film narrative interviews. So we film patients telling the story of their experience of whichever service it is that we're working in. We bring the patients, families together, and we create a trigger film, a short trigger film, normally sort of 20, 25 minutes long, from those film narrative interviews. And through a process of facilitated discussions, we get to a point where the patients and the family members have identified what are the aspects of the service that they'd really like to improve. We bring the staff and patients together for the first time at a co-design meeting. The staff sit with the patients and families, they watch the film, they hear about what the patients and families have identified as improvement priorities, and together the staff and patients then agree on what their shared improvement priorities are. Those then go forward to these small co-design teams, which have staff, patients as participants in those teams, and they work on one of the specific improvement priorities using lots of design tools and techniques, ideation techniques, very creative, using prototypes, testing them out. Then we bring them together, bring them back together again at the celebration event. The co-design teams report on what they've done. And then the idea is that this is a cyclical process. This isn't a time-limited project. The idea is this becomes a way of doing quality improvement. If you could click, Fiona. And there are three sort of key features: patients at the heart of the quality improvement effort, but not forgetting staff. A focus on designing experiences, not just systems or processes. So it's important to get systems or processes right, but if we want to deliver really high quality services, we need to pay much more attention to the lived experience, both of staff and patients. And it's where staff and patients participate alongside one another to co-design services. Okay, Fiona? And I think so there's lots of interesting tools and methods that we can bring from design thinking, from co-design to apply to our quality improvement work. But the important thing for me is that this is about a mindset change, about a different way of working with patients and staff on an equal footing as co-designers of the service that they're either providing or receiving. If you click, Fiona. But I think the important thing is this isn't a sort of a sacred object. It's very flexible. You should use, adapt, tailor these methods and this approach. The key is the process of thinking with this mindset change. So just to give you some examples, when we started the work 16 years ago, it was very much around as a local quality improvement intervention. So this is the Learning Disabilities Project that I'll say a bit more about in a moment. There are projects in Washington State, in the US. Yes, Fiona, thanks. This is one with mothers, caregivers in a South African township. This is a New Zealand project, an orthopedic service. And there are projects going on underway in the US funded by lots of the sort of mainstream quality improvement bodies. If you click, Fiona, thanks. We didn't start here, but increasingly in the last few years, people have used experience-based co-design as a way of developing specific interventions using the Medical Research Council Complex Interventions Framework. So if you could click, Fiona. So this is a project where we worked with carers of patients receiving outpatient chemotherapy. We use experience-based co-design to develop a complex intervention, and then you can test that in a feasibility trial. There are lots of doctoral, postdoctoral studies now using experience-based co-design as their method. And one more click, Fiona, thanks. And then there's lots of funded research. I'm going to talk about the CREATE project in stroke services, but there's projects in Sweden and the US and other places, some funded by the EU. Okay, so just to ground that a little bit, I just thought I'd give you an example of an experience-based co-design project. So this was a project, if you click, Fiona. So this is called the My Care, My Voice project. So Jane, who you see showing off her process map and all of the post-its on her wall, she worked in a learning disabilities service in Leicestershire. She came to a training program that we run through the Point of Care Foundation, learned about experience-based co-design, went back to her service and ran there, I think, a really fantastic project. So we've just got a short film, which fingers crossed is going to work on Fiona's computer in a way it didn't on mine. It's about 3 or 4 minutes long, and it'll just give you a sense of what it's like to take part in these types of projects.
when nobody's listening to me and nobody says help, gets me help or anything, I feel like nobody cares about people anymore. Not just me, but everybody else.
To have people not listen to you or not to believe what you're saying, or they think they know better than you do, makes me really quite cross.
I don't think staff really get it, and that we've just got it slightly wrong in terms of our engagement with people. Sometimes I found it hard to think about the best ways to communicate with people with learning disability. Sometimes I know I would say things and the person didn't understand.
Doctor could listen to me a bit more. Doctor could be understanding a bit more. And doctors shouldn't rush people with learning disabilities and special needs, and shouldn't really, by rights, rush anybody. It's annoying, isn't it, when people don't listen to you, and I think they're not looking you in the eye that one. It's not very nice. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I just find people just don't listen to anything.
Since the project, I've thought more about my communication, and I've really slowed down. I've let the person have more time. It means that they lead the interaction more, the conversation comes more from them. So I think you feel more at the end that you've really got the person's views, that they've had a real chance to give their ideas and to contribute to what you're doing, so you're working more together. So what does that feel like for you, if someone gives you the time?
Don't rush it. Take your time. Take time as you need. And help me.
I think it's really good.
Yeah, yes, it is.
When did I start listening to it?
Yes, it is. It makes someone's listening to you and you're getting to sing when they sort and sing out and all. Yeah.
I just find it gives away with confidence.
It is.
We talk about putting ourselves in other people's shoes, but we can't actually do that unless we've had that experience.
I know I'm not the important one, my son's the important one, but in order for him to get the service that he deserves and the treatment that he deserves, I have to speak up, and that I have to be allowed to speak up.
But I think that's just so powerful what you just said. I read that. It really brings tears to my eyes, because the power of this sort of project is you continue to be engaged with us, don't you? It's not like we'll come and have a chat with you and then go away and nothing ever changes.
No.
That we make the changes together. So I think that's the difference.
Yes, yeah.
Basically, it's just fab. It's just fantastic. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. That's very cool.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. So, is that okay, Fiona? If you could, yeah, great. So I think it's a wonderful, so there's been hundreds of these projects now in about 7 different countries. That's a particularly wonderful example, I think. And I hope what it gets over is that this is a relational process. This is about creating a space where healthcare professionals, patients can have a different relationship and a different type of conversation. And yes, they use these different co-design tools, which are very creative, and they bring about specific improvements. You saw some of them listed on the presentation there, but it's about a mindset change. Okay, so I just wanted to end, I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to end with this project that Fiona led, the CREATE project. If you go to the next slide, Fiona. So as most of you will know, much better than me, patients in the acute stroke phase often don't get enough cognitive, physical, social activity, whether they're on acute wards. There's been years and years of top-down targets and measures and audits to try and improve, enhance, increase levels of activity on acute wards, and they haven't been particularly successful. So Fiona had the idea that we should try experience-based co-design and see if that made more of a difference. And we worked on 4 stroke wards, 2 in London and 2 up in the north that David Clark led. I'm sure many of you know David. And we used experience-based co-design in the way that I've just described, that same process, 6-stage process, filmed out of interviews with patients, interviews with staff, brought them together in a co-design process, and we tested whether we could improve levels, quality of activity on these acute stroke wards. Yes, please, Fiona. So I won't go through all the detail. This was a very sort of data-rich study, mixed method study, took about 3 years in 4 stroke units, lots of non-participant observation. We did some very detailed behavioural mapping before and after the experience-based co-design process. We also used some patient-reported experience and outcome measures. Next slide, please, Fiona. One of the things I just wanted to highlight, I'll get on to what we actually found in the CREATE project in a moment. But one thing that really struck me, I've been involved in lots of these projects now, or have heard about lots of these projects now. The thing that really came out of the CREATE project was the extent and level of community involvement that happened on these 4 wards. So the co-design activities initiated new and an ongoing engagement with local people and or organisations for whom those hospitals were a key part of their community. So some examples: in one of the sites, one of the family members who was involved in the co-design process worked as a local artist. Together with her colleagues, she applied for funding and organised art workshops on the wards over the weekends. And you can see some other examples on the slides there. And that kind of stood out for me for this project, was the extent and really the quality of the local community involvement on these 4 acute stroke wards. Yes, thank you, Fiona. And just a couple of quotes from some of the interview data. So one of the staff members on one of the wards: "We have huge gaps in the day where your patient's doing nothing, they're bored, they become institutionalized. So with these extras, like your volunteers coming in, you've got various groups, got a cooking club, cooking group, breakfast club, your lunch club. It just makes for it's a more positive experience." Okay, thanks, Fiona. And the next slide. And the actual results, I'll go through these quite quickly. You can, the final report hasn't been published yet, but there's an early view on the link that's at the bottom of the slide. So what happened on these 4 wards was that it was feasible to co-produce changes to increase social, cognitive and physical activity. On each of the wards, they split into 3 co-design teams around space, activity and communication. For example, in the first 2 wards, they co-produced, implemented more than 40 improvements. The types of improvements were, if you could click, Fiona, things like environmental and organizational changes, so changing day rooms, making changes to the physical environment, engagement with community groups, as I mentioned, therapy dogs, personalizing bed spaces. Those are the types of changes that were made on these 4 wards. We did some interviews with the patients, family members and staff after the EBCD process, and the types of things they spoke about, Fiona, were patients and families perceived positive benefits from participating in the co-design process, felt they were equal and valued members and gained satisfaction from seeing the improvements being implemented, and staff reported create the co-design process being a positive experience, and they contrasted it to their usual work with little time for creative thought and those relational activities. Next slide, Fiona. So this is my penultimate slide. So just the observations we did after EBCD confirmed that the use of new social spaces where patients and families could meet and interact provided more activity opportunities. The sort of the quantitative data that we pulled out from the behavioural mapping and the PROMs and the PREMs were a bit mixed. But if you took the broad measure of any activity, there was improvement across all the sites. But it was a mixed picture between the social, cognitive, and physical in the 4 sites. It was a bit more complicated than it might have first seemed. But in terms of any activity, there was improvement across all 4. Next bullet, please, Fiona. And the next one. So, and all the participants recognised that increased activity needed to be embedded in everyday routines and work in stroke units. But the bit that was the most challenging to implement was the communication between staff and patients, which supported activity. So there was still a challenge around getting this really embedded in the culture and the day-to-day routines of these wards. Next slide, Fiona. And this I think neatly takes us back to Erstrom's original work, which is where I started around co-production. So we can run these co-design projects as discrete projects, and we've learned over the last 15 years, I hope, how to do that quite well. And so you can hear about the types of project that Jane ran with the Learning Disability Service, or the CREATE project that Fiona and David led. But the problem is how you embed this into everyday work and into the organizational structures in NHS organizations. So Erstrom said, designing institutional arrangements that help successful co-productive strategies is far more daunting than demonstrating their theoretical existence. So we know that this stuff works around co-production and co-design, but getting it really embedded into the way in which services are delivered is still challenging. I just got one final slide. Fiona will have seen this before. This is one of my favorite slides. I stole it from a co-production workshop run in Surrey. But so we hear a lot about co-production nowadays in health and social care. This is a lovely flow diagram that probably represents quite a few of the case studies that you see written up. So if you start in the top left, choose the service you want to co-produce, talk to people, no, are you mad, say you did, declare success, write a case study. Talk to people, yeah, all right, listen, no, are you quite mad, say you did, declare success, write a case study. Listen, okay, invite users to work with you, no, clearly you are certifiable, say you did, declare success, write a case study. Invite users to work with you, put engagement barriers in place, do they still come, no, job done, declare success, write a case study. Do they still come? Yes. Can you sabotage? Yes. Job done, declare success, right? A case study, etc., etc. There's a real positive bias in the literature and the write-ups of these co-design and co-production projects, and we need to be very careful about that. This is really challenging work. It takes time. It's based on relationships and trust, and it needs to be authentic. And I think quite a few of the co-production case studies you see written up are perhaps fall into some of the traps represented in this flow diagram. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Glenn. We've got a bit of time, so we're going to run slightly longer with our presentation bit because Claire and Scott are going to do the next section. But guys, I am going to cut you off at 10 minutes if that's okay, just so we've got 20 minutes of discussion. Yeah. If you haven't already, it's probably worth changing your view to speaker view because they're going to be talking between themselves. They're not going to have PowerPoint slides, so you should do that now. And I will mute and hand over to you guys.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So just hi everyone, I'm Scott, for any of those that don't know me. And I was thinking back about this earlier on and actually realised that the way that I came involved with Bridges was through co-production and actually the co-production of the new Bridges stroke workbook. So there's an interesting fact for you. But Claire, let's introduce you. So can you tell us a bit about yourself and kind of some of the projects that you've been involved with and kind of how they are coping with the kind of COVID situation?
Yeah, hi, I'm Claire, everyone. I know a few faces on here, but for those who haven't met me, I work with Bridges as a lived experience associate because I was diagnosed with cancer as a teenager and I have a lot of long-term and ongoing and incurable conditions, so I'm constantly in and out of hospitals. So I've been involved in quite a lot of co-production in quite a few different ways. Been involved in sort of co-produced healthcare research in charities, and particularly cancer charities, Macmillan and a smaller charity, co-designing services and support kind of documents. I've also worked with the CQC as a patient expert, and obviously I'm involved with Bridges, which is co-produced. And on a more kind of practical service level, I've been involved in making changes within the healthcare services that I use. So I thought just a little example, and somebody mentioned earlier, they don't have to be huge projects. I mean, one thing that was, I thought was quite notable was at St George's, I did pulmonary rehabilitation, and there was a big problem with people not carrying on the exercise after they'd finished their course of rehab. But it wasn't really acknowledged. And I talked to some of the physios about whether we could put in a session in the follow-up about not continuing pulmonary rehab and why you might not, and all the reasons. And I think they were a bit worried about doing that because it might feel that they were being punitive, but actually having invited me to design that session and deliver it, it was much easier for a patient to deliver that kind of message than perhaps it might have been for a professional. So it was just a small change in just one session in a series that they delivered, but I think it made quite a difference. So I've been involved in co-production on lots of different levels. In terms of Scott's question about how they've coped with COVID, I think it's been quite different. I think the research projects seem to have sort of coped better. I don't know, they seem to be continuing online, and it's quite consistent. And I think maybe I'm not an academic, but I seem to learn that academia works a bit slower than the rest of the world, and maybe therefore it's easier to stagger out those sessions. I am slightly worried that the co-production of the services that are not related to COVID has kind of slightly fallen by the wayside. I've got a lot of requests to be involved in projects about how COVID is affecting people with respiratory disease like I have, or cancer treatment. So that has continued, but I do think COVID has affected those projects that are based on people living with other conditions. Yeah.
And do you think there have been any kind of benefits to the co-production process that have come around as a result of the kind of COVID, the nature of the kind of COVID situation that we've been in, so kind of lockdown and social distancing and that kind of thing?
I think for sure, I mean, personally, I've definitely got more time. I'm in a shielding group, I'm stuck at home and I can't go anywhere. So I've got more time on my hands to engage in these projects. And I think, I was just thinking generally as a kind of patient group, there's much more talk about how the NHS is coping at the moment, and appreciation of it and of the hard work that's going on. And maybe that will encourage as well people to think, I'd like to be engaged and help support that service and those processes. But on a very practical level, I think, I mean, I know I do some work with charities that support younger people with cancer, and we have Zoom, like the Zoom meetups that we do. And we've realized actually we're reaching people that we never could before because they couldn't come out to our in-person social gatherings. And so now we're having people join us from hospital beds or from people who are stuck at home bedbound. And I think actually it's kind of opened our eyes as a charity that's possible, and there's no reason why that's not the same as co-production, that actually it might broaden your pool of people who you've got to work with, because travel is now no longer an issue.
And you can pull from a wider geographical kind of base as well, can't you?
Absolutely. I mean, it might be that, yeah, the kind of diversity in co-production is often a problem, a challenge to get people from a broad base of backgrounds and cultures and ages, and maybe this is a time when that will get slightly easier. Okay,
so on the flip side of that, what do you kind of feel have been the drawbacks of the kind of COVID situation to the co-production landscape?
I think, having just said it might broaden the pool, I think there's also a risk that reliance on technology will also narrow the group who can access. Obviously, not everyone has the technology available, and if they do have it, not everyone is comfortable with this format. So on a practical level, you've got, you know, pros and cons there. I think also, for me, the key thing that I'm sure everyone finds on Zoom is that building relationships is such an important part of co-production for me. Like, I feel the projects that I've done where I've really felt valued and included and part of a team rather than just someone who's been sort of brought in to give their sick story or whatever. I think the ones where they've really worked is where the relationships have been strong and they felt genuine and authentic. And that is hard to foster over Zoom. I think it's a real challenge, and it's not impossible, but I think it's definitely one of the drawbacks.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've definitely noticed that the projects where they had some kind of in-person relationship before COVID and have then had to transition to working remotely have definitely done better than the ones that have started up from a new kind of since COVID has started. And I think it's probably because they've had those existing relationships. And as you say, kind of trying to build those online has perhaps been a bit more difficult. Yeah, it's and I think also, you know, talking about the kind of inequalities, just kind of access to internet as well. just the cost of accessing the internet, or having the technology to be able to access, but also the technical literacy to be able to access, things like Zoom and that as well. I guess a lot of us feel like it's fairly straightforward, but actually for a lot of people it's quite difficult. So it's being conscious of those things when you're designing design co-production projects. Okay, so let's look at some practical things that people can do, kind of fairly straightforward things that people can do. Any kind of ideas that people can do to try and help implement just basic kind of good co-production practice?
Yeah, it's hard because it really does feel to me it's like a way of being rather than a checklist. And I think that's what you want to get away from, is this kind of tick box feeling of paying lip service to involving people and saying, yes, we've asked and they've answered and we've done it, and they're exactly like that. Flowchart was just showing us. But I tried to come up with a few pointers, I guess. I think the key thing has to be relationship building, like focus on the relationship rather than I can't say, there's nothing worse than being asked to attend a group to co-produce a service because you are a cancer patient. You really need 10 cancer patients. And it's just really kind of, it takes away from your personal experience. You're just there as an illness to represent this. And obviously no two cancer patients are the same. And you want a diverse voice within that group as well. So I guess one point is to really, in terms of making people not feel like they're just a statistic on your list, really kind of build that personal relationship. And I'd say in this time at the moment, maybe just a one-to-one call before you all join this kind of mega group where you're not quite sure if you can see everyone, you don't know everyone in the room. I think that would be the first point for me.
Yeah, and I think for me, another really big one, and this is kind of for virtual co-production, but also face-to-face, is it's actually feeling like I have a role, like I'm not just there to give my opinion, but actually that I have some kind of ownership over the project and have some kind of agency in that project, and I have the ability to affect some of the decisions in that project as well. Even if it's something like being part of designing a leaflet, I have some aspect of the decision making in that leaflet design, or I'm sent out to try and research where we can maybe get that printed, or some of those kind of things, rather than just being consulted on, what do you think of this leaflet? Okay, yeah, that's great, we'll go away and get that done and printed. Actually being
sorry.
No, carry on.
It never feels like co-production when you're called in to give your feedback on something that's already been designed. That doesn't feel, that's not the same thing, is it? I also thought, just briefly as well, I think a key thing for me as a patient is acknowledging that power imbalance, which it's really lovely that we all are really working hard to get over that and try and make this an equitable relationship, but it's there. And it's, growing up in hospitals, you can't avoid the fact that when I walk into a room full of clinicians or researchers, I feel at a disadvantage. I don't know what you know, and I think not to say acknowledge it and then you have to work within it, but acknowledge it even just down to the small details, like maybe don't meet in clinical environments, because that's your world, not mine. Those, keep that power balance always in your mind when you're setting out these projects, because I think if you want authentic reactions from patients, don't put them in a role where they are a patient, because they'll, that would be my other point.
We've only got 16 minutes left. Was there anything that you quickly wanted to add in before I rudely cut you off?
No, I think let's see what everyone else wants to.
Because it would be great to get a couple of questions. We can always continue the discussion later on the Facebook group. Does anyone have any question? If we go back to gallery view, has anyone got any questions for Glenn or for Scott or Claire? Lots of brilliant comments coming through. If you've got a question, just unmute your mic and go for it, because I can't see everything.
Could I ask a quick question? Would that be all right?
Go on then.
Quickly. Glenn, I just picking up on what Claire has just said, I just scribbled it down about the power imbalance and how critical that is. What do you think it is about experience-based co-design that helps to address the power imbalance? Because certainly that was the thing that struck me when I went through the whole process of Create, was that we thought it would be an issue, but in fact it wasn't. So I just wonder, having been involved in so many projects, what your thoughts are around that.
So I think what Claire was saying is absolutely right. It's about relationships, and building these new relationships takes time and it takes trust. And I think one of the things that experience-based co-design does, or any other kind of structured co-design process, is it does give that structure. And I think one of the helpful things we did, like, it sort of landed on it by accident really, but we always framed it in terms of quality improvement. And so we could kind of sell it to staff and to managers in healthcare organizations as this is a quality improvement technique. You know, and other people have tried it and it's worked, so it might work in your service. But it was always something of a Trojan horse for us. So yes, it's great when you watch Jane's video and you see those small incremental changes come up about they've improved the information leaflets and there's patients on the interview panels. That's all great. That's all really good incremental first order improvements. But what we're really interested in the process is the second order mindset change of staff, and particularly staff, I think, opening up to the idea that there's a different way of doing things and of engaging and relating to their patients in a different way. And that takes time. There is no quick win. As we just heard in the conversation, there's such a difference between this type of change process and a one-off consultation where you're brought in to kind of approve changes that have already been made or been decided. This is much more emergent. It's much more challenging for staff, I think, and so it takes time, and you need that change process to give that time and space for staff to act in different ways. Yeah.
Thanks, Glenn.
Else? Thanks, Glenn. Anyone else got any comments or questions?
I've got a question.
Go for it.
So I think, so I work in respiratory rehab and respiratory long-term conditions management and acute respiratory. And I think I make steps to encourage co-production and contribution. And what I'm interested in is how I can engage in a broader voice and think about recruiting and listening to the unheard voice. Because sometimes we know what we always ask and we don't know from the population that we don't actively engage with, and it's really thinking about hints and tips for that, really.
And that mirrors actually what Claire, you were saying when we did the rehearsal, that you tend to see the same people being involved in co-production projects that you're going to.
Yeah.
I think it's about having a multi-pronged approach to how you approach, like how you try and access people. So it's not just accessing people through an email or not just accessing people through a leaflet. So you need to kind of go to people in the medium that they feel most comfortable. So yeah, you kind of really need to try and mix up that method to try and get as varied and a kind of varied array of people as possible, to try and engage them in in kind of different types of conversation. That's what I would say. But Claire, you might have some different thoughts.
I was going to say, I guess it kind of depends whether the issue is that you don't have access to the people to create a diverse group, or when you do access them, they don't want to engage. I guess those are two different problems. But I think if the problem is that people kind of aren't really willing to involve, I think maybe it's about shifting the narrative about what we're asking people for. Because actually, as a patient, to be asked to give feedback again about my experience, which you're asked every time you go to any appointment ever, it gets a bit tedious, it's a bit boring. But for someone to come to me and say, you know what, we don't want just your story of illness. What we want is your insight, because you are an expert and your experience is valued. And we can't change services without you. You're necessary to this. And it makes you feel like, oh, this isn't a tick box exercise. This is kind of genuine. And I think that would encourage me to be involved in something that I might otherwise be like, oh, another thing.
Thank you very much.
Could I just answer that as well? Because we had I was just thinking about the whole process of experience-based co-design, and actually part of the bringing patients, staff and families together is that you make that group as large as you possibly can. And by making that group really, really huge, actually then people can, you know, always within a group, there are people that naturally feel they want to be much quieter in the group. But actually you can do lots of different techniques to break off into smaller groups to try and really encourage people's voices to come through. And thinking back to what we did in the Create project in the stroke unit, we had, for instance, one of the events, we had nearly 60 people, and people came with their friends and their family and lots of different, so it wasn't just the patients there, it was they were there with their friends and families as well. And out of that, and I posted it on Facebook as an example, because out of that, one of the daughters of a guy that had had a stroke, who was also a local artist, just quietly sort of put forward some ideas about what we could do to the stroke unit. And through that, she didn't want to volunteer for any co-design groups at all, but I just quietly went off and I really twisted her arm to be involved, because I just said, I just said things like, you know, it's just being honest. I don't think you realise actually how much we need the help of artists in this, and how much we need that creative voice. And often people don't recognise how, you know, what skills that they can potentially bring. Now, this also brought people from a minority ethnic group, a huge group of people, local artists, into this project. So it was a real, you know, it was just that fortuitous discussion, but I don't think that would have happened if we'd have just invited a very small group. And I don't know what you think, Glenn, whether...
Yeah, just very quickly. So the experience-based co-design process might seem quite convoluted, and then we've got these 6 stages. It takes until the 4th stage where we bring the staff and patients together. That's very, very deliberate. What we don't want to do is to have patients coming along as individuals telling their individual stories, because that's the way we normally collect patient feedback. And it's not very good for quality improvement work. It's not very authentic. Staff don't know what to do with those individual stories and that individual feedback. What we want the patients and the families to tell their individual stories to other patients and families, so that when they meet staff for the first time, they're not going as a collection of individuals, they're going as a collective group of patients who have shared their experiences. And so staff can't say, as sometimes happens with lots of patient feedback mechanisms, oh, that's just one patient, or that's not my patient, or that's not authentic, because they're a collective, they're a community of patients saying, no, these are our shared experiences of your service. And yes, there are differences, but there are some similarities, and there are some shared improvement priorities that we've agreed based on our collective experiences we really want to address with you. So although it might seem like it takes a long time to bring patients and staff together in the co-design process, that's deliberate, because we want to overcome these power imbalances that happen normally when patients give individual feedback. Staff can't walk away from this. They can't say that isn't authentic, because the patients are sitting there with them saying, no, these are our shared experiences. And that's us on that film you've just watched, talking about them. So it's a very deliberate strategy. Yeah.
Thank you.
We've got 7 minutes. Is there anyone else that's got another question or another point that they wanted to make?
It was just a question about when we're doing co-design in the community, where it can be, you know, harder to get people together to get those relationships going. And I absolutely agree with what Claire was saying. Zoom isn't always the best way to get those going. I just wonder if you've got any advice about how we can begin to build that community together, you know, when you're more geographically dispersed, and Zoom could be an option, but have you got any other ideas we can use?
Can I nip in? I think because of the given situation, I think at the moment it could be a great start, actually, Zoom, because everyone, I would have seen it, can't say everyone, sorry about that. I would have seen it as this is the way forward, the only one I can do and the safest one for me. Plus I'm in my home environment, and to start off something, I would probably, so maybe to use the opportunity, I would see it personally as I wouldn't be scared of it, to use it as an opportunity to get the people in to start it off. And then later on, when it comes to it, you might have already groups that are formed, and then you can place them geographically together or create an event like Fiona was saying. But I don't know, I'm not the expert, it's just sorry.
Scott, you said when we were talking the other day how many different platforms you'd been on over the last...
Yeah, I mean, they're all... Yeah, I mean, there are loads of different platforms. I'm sure we've all been on loads of different platforms. I mean, the things like WhatsApp groups work really well, and generally a lot of people have access to things like that as well. But actually, you know, sometimes just sending out like mail and stuff as well to people. So, you know, I will come back again to having that really mixed approach. So you can have the whole kind of, you know, everyone in the Zoom room together, but actually getting kind of people's feedback on an approach as individuals, but they're contributing to a collaborative goal. So you know, if there's a system that you're looking to get kind of input in from service users, you know, sending out mail to them, you know, if you've got buy-in from them, sending out mail to them with a stamped address envelope so they can send it back to you, you know, that is still kind of part of the kind of co-design, co-production process. And
for me, I think it mirrors, in a way, goal setting. I think it's useful to use whatever method someone is currently using to communicate with their friends and family. So everybody's using various different platforms, phone calls, and different things will work for different people.
Yeah, I was going to say as well, I think part of what Glenn was saying about building this kind of collective voice rather than just these individual stories. I mean, I know when I was first diagnosed, I was quite young and I didn't want to talk to anyone else because I was a teenager and I was awkward, but I got the nurses on the ward got other people to just write notes to me who were on the ward and were also teenage, and they sent, so we had this collection of messages, and I really felt part of that group, and I didn't have to meet them or see them or talk to them. But then when I was well enough and I did want to, that link had already been engaged, and it was lovely putting names to faces. And so I think there are different ways that, almost like as a holding pattern in this time when things are much more difficult, just to keep that communication and like kind of trying to get this feeling of being one of many rather than just isolated on your own. I think that could help too.
And also I think that once you've got some degree of a community or some patients that you can call on, you can ask them like anything. If the whole stage of a project, if you're doing like a small service improvement project, then actually, I mean, one of the most useful things about being within Bridges is you've got loads of people that you can call on, and you can just phone up and say, I want to ask some questions. Do the questions sound all right? Does the idea sound all right? You can check in at every point and get a different sounding board, which is so useful. And I think sometimes clinicians can really overcomplicate it and get a bit bogged down by it. But actually, if you're working on a ward, you can go onto a ward, and if you're doing some kind of leaflet or poster or whatever you want to do in your service, if you ask anybody on the ward that's a patient, you're going to get a different perspective than your own as a professional. It's not going to be representative, but it's going to be a different perspective, which is really useful. And I think sometimes there can be some worries or some barriers about just asking people as a very basic starting point.
I think.
Oh, sorry.
I have a bit of a thought. I think that at the moment I've been overwhelmed with people have got a very fond response to the NHS at the moment, and we go out and we clap and we do these things. And also I think people have, some people have a bit more time on their hands. So I think we're in a position where we are, this is a great opportunity this time for us to actually just reach out and see what happens. So better now than never.
We are 1 minute away from finishing. So if you have any other questions or comments, you're very welcome to email us or to put them in the Facebook community. But just before you all leave and get on with your dinners and your evenings, can you just put one word in the chat window for how you're feeling now, post-webinar? And whilst you're doing that, I can give you the heads up that our next webinar will be looking at creating connection when having remote consultations. So that seems to have come up a lot throughout, and is a very Bridgesy topic. So we'll have some guest speakers. We can't confirm those at the moment, but we will shortly. It'll be in 3 weeks. I think that's the 29th of July on Wednesday at 7:30. Words that we're getting are reflective, thought-provoked, lots to do, inspired, fired up. As always, thank you so much for using your own time to join us. We really appreciate it, and we hope that the webinar has been useful. So thank you very much, and thank you so much to our speakers.
Thank you, Glenn.